If it's Friday, it's all about message, money, and momentum. As House Republicans roll out a new midterm agenda, President Biden responds at a rally, and the overall environment is becoming clearer every day. Plus, the special master gives Trump's lawyers one last chance to back up his claims of an FBI conspiracy, as at least a half a dozen investigations actively swirl around the former president. And Iran tries to quash mass protests sweeping the nation as the regime announces 26 deaths tied to the historic anti-government movement and chokes off the internet access for its 80 million citizens as women rise up. Happy Friday. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd here in Washington. We're going to get to all of our big political stories of the day, but we're going to begin with the breaking news on Wall Street. It is a Black Friday, if you will, where markets are finishing off a tough week with a bad day, though the Fed may be happy because stocks dropped roughly 2% across the board, with the Dow dropping into bear market territory during today's trading, and the S&P hitting a new low for the year as investors grapple with growing concerns about rising interest rates and the potential for a deepening recession in Europe. Let's bring in CNBC's Christina Partsinevelos, who has more. So, Christina, is Jay Powell happy right now?
I guess if he's following his dual mandate of trying to bring down inflation, and that means hiking up interest rates, then maybe he could say, I'm happy, I'm doing my job. Yeah. But if you see the reaction in the markets, the sell-off, the S&P 500, for example, almost every single stock closed in the red this week. We're seeing oil drop to below $80 a barrel. We haven't seen that since January. The NASDAQ, which is predominantly a little bit more tech-heavy, falling lower. And there's just been a lot of volatility, especially towards the end of the day, and that's because we're worried about how aggressive the Federal Reserve and Jay Powell is going to be come the next meeting. Right. In terms of making debt.
Well, it's not just that, but Christina, it seems like the Fed did their deal and a bunch of other central banks followed suit. Is this what we're seeing today, the cascading sort of international impact of all of this? That this is, whether we know we're headed into a global recession or not, there's certainly a global sell-off.
Yeah, and that's a great point, because if you look at just even the dollar denomination, the USD versus the pound, the fact that the pound, that ratio fell to a 37-year low. We're seeing issues in Switzerland. We're seeing the same kind of scenario in Japan. So, yes, it is a global market, and everything is interconnected. There's a big concern about Europe. You bring up energy prices and just what that means. So we constantly on our network talk about the looming recession in Europe. And so that doesn't bode well for multinational companies here in the United States that need to do business abroad. They're denominated in USD, which is so high. So that makes that exchange rate really bad. And then you've just got over here interest rates that keep climbing. We're expecting rates to go up, 75 basis points come November again. So that means debt, mortgage rates, credit cards, all more expensive.
I want to ask you about the strong dollar. It's normally, should we be happy we have a strong dollar? I assume yes, but, right? What is the but?
Do you have any trips planned? Because then I would say yes. Like, I'm going to London next week, so I'm happy about that. But if you really look at the markets and corporate profits, a lot of them will have to factor in these currency fluctuations. And based off of what we've been talking about, everything I've been reading, the research, it seems like we haven't even factored in the strong dollar and what that means to the bottom line for a lot of corporations. Think of BMW is not American, but think Pepsi or Procter & Gamble. They have businesses all around the globe, and so a strong dollar may be good here, but not necessarily for their businesses abroad.
Christina Partsinevelos, really appreciate you breaking this down for us. Good to see you.
Thanks.
All right, let's turn to politics. 46 days until the midterms, and don't think the current economic environment it could have an impact as well. When do we get an energy spike bill, for instance, right? But the midterm environment in general does appear to be solidifying. And what we're looking at is not a wave, but rather multiple cross currents. Some races will be decided over the economy. Some will be on the issue of abortion. Some will be on crime, and so on. It really is a race-by-race slugfest to decide control of both the House and the Senate. Overall, the The issue Republicans appear to be struggling with the most is the quality of key candidates in statewide races, in large part due to former President Trump's outsized influence in the party. Our friends, for instance, at the Cook Political Report just moved the Senate race in Arizona. Let me repeat that. The Senate race in Arizona from toss-up to lean Democrat, putting it in the same place as New Hampshire. Both are states where popular, more moderate Republican governors opted against a Senate run because of the presence of Trump. And it paved the way for a more hardline Trump acolyte to win those primaries. Candidate quality is also causing Republicans some headaches in the battle for the House. They just pulled their funding in a key Ohio congressional race after the Associated Press reported that the GOP nominee, J.R. Majewski, misrepresented his military service. You just don't usually see a party hoping for a wave election pull out of a toss-up district like that and a big Senate race like Arizona, as they did earlier this week, this close to an election day. As for Democrats, among other issues, they have a money problem. As we reported today in First Read, Democratic PACs aren't seeing the big money checks from the billionaire backers like Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, leaving Democratic groups lagging behind their 2018 advantage that they had at this very moment in time as we hit this 2022 homestretch. Candidates in the must-flip states of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin have recently sounded the alarm on fundraising. As for messaging, House Republicans telegraphed the issues they want to talk about over the next 45 days, announcing they call it a commitment for America. It's a play on the party's successful 1994 blueprint that was called the Contract for America. Take a listen to how they outlined it.
We want an economy that is strong. That means you can fill up your tank. We have a plan for a nation that's safe. That means your community will be protected. Your law enforcement will be respected. We believe in a future that's built on freedom. That your children come first. And we believe in a check and balance, that government should be accountable.
President Biden responded a few hours later with the issue that Democrats would like to be talking about for the next 45 days, abortion rights.
He said Republicans want to, quote, preserve our constitutional freedom. That sounds great. I'm for doing that as well. We all are. But look at what they've actually done. The MAGA Republicans just cheered and embraced the first Supreme Court decision in our entire history, the first one in our entire history, that just didn't fail to preserve a constitutional freedom. It actually took away a fundamental right that had been granted by the same court.
Well, our reporters are literally coast to coast today around the country on the campaign trail. Shaq Brewster's on the ground for us in Wisconsin. He's following that marquee Senate race where crime is becoming a big issue. Certainly Republicans want to make it so. Guad Venegas is following the Nevada Senate race where the focus is clearly on the economy, though we're seeing a move by Democrats to push abortion rights. Vaughn Hilliard's in North Carolina. He's ahead of former President Donald Trump's rally tonight that will include the Republican Senate nominee Ted Budd. And CNBC's Elon Moy is in Pittsburgh. She was at Kevin McCarthy's Republican messaging event this morning and even got a few minutes with him. But let's start because crime is certainly one of the pillars Kevin McCarthy talked about. They want to put more cops on the street. And there's probably no Senate race in the country where crime is more front and center than Wisconsin. Shaq, it was that way today, wasn't it?
That's exactly the case, Chuck. And, you know, Ron Johnson just wrapped up a roundtable with members of the community, law enforcement, talking about the issue of crime and using this as an opportunity to attack his Democratic opponent, Mandela Barnes. But look, this is nothing new in this race. We know from polling that came out earlier in this week, our NBC News poll, that crime is an issue that Republicans feel very comfortable about. This is one where when you ask voters which party they think would do a better job at dealing with the issue, they side with Republicans. It's an all-time high, according to our latest poll. So that's why you're having Republican candidates, not just here in Wisconsin, but across the country, push this issue of crime and calling their Democratic opponents weak on crime. And that is what we heard earlier today. We saw also some protesters outside because we've been seeing this issue play out on the television airwaves. Protesters calling the ads that you've been seeing talking about this issue as of crime, they've been calling those ads racist. And I want you to see a little bit of what voters are seeing here when they turn on the TV, that ad war that's playing out. Watch this.
Violent attacks on our police. More than 300 murders last year alone. Yet Barnes has even supported defunding the police. Mandela Barnes, he stands with them. not us.
We knew the other side would make up lies about me to scare you. Now they're claiming I want to defund the police and abolish ICE. That's a lie. I'll make sure our police have the resources and training they need to keep our community safe.
You see how Mandela Barnes is having to play a little bit of defense on that attack ad talking about crime, though that's coming from an outside group, not the Johnson campaign itself. One other thing, note, Chuck, although we played about even amount of time for both of those ads, if you're here in Milwaukee, if you're here in Wisconsin, you're not seeing those ads equally. It's those attack ads that you're seeing much more frequently, a sign of how those outside Republican groups are outspending the Democratic groups in crucial battleground states like Wisconsin.
You know, it's interesting when they say the tagline "them," Shaq. I noticed in one of the ads, it's Mandela Barnes, and then it's AOC, and I think it's Rashida Tlaib in shadow behind. Is that the them that is being used here?
It's not clear, Chuck. You know, one of the ads, they do say he will, Mandela Barnes will be another member of the squad. And they're painting him and clumping him with that group, saying he will be too far left, too liberal for Wisconsin. In the ad in which they said he's for them, not us, they're suggesting that he's for criminals. Right before they talked about the increase in homicides. And look, one part of this is that you look at the crime rate here in Milwaukee. Yes, it did go up when you look at the past 2 years. Homicides up about 20%. Motor vehicle theft up double from about 2 years ago. But you have both candidates talking about the issue differently. For Ron Johnson, he was talking about solving it through education and having that being the main solve for this, fixing morals and values in schools. Mandela Barnes, he's saying he wants to solve this by attacking the issue of guns, of firearms. That's something that you hear from many of the police chiefs, for example, here in Milwaukee and Chicago. Those are cities that continuously get referenced in those ads.
Shaq, bottom line, right now this race is being dominated by an issue that Republicans are winning by 20 points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
100% true. You do hear them talking about inflation and abortion. Those are something that are issues that voters say that matter to them and will drive them to the polls. But in terms of what you're seeing as the biggest clashes, it's this issue of crime here.
All right. Shaquille Brewster in Wisconsin for us. Shaq, thank you. Let's go to Guad Venegas. He's out in Nevada. And look, there's certainly, I think Republicans are probably more bullish about the Nevada Senate race right now than any other Democratic-held seat in the country. What are you seeing?
Chuck, well, Republicans were looking at Nevada as a place where they could flip the seat, right? Adam Laxalt being that nominee facing Catherine Cortez Masto, the Latina incumbent Democratic. So, you know, you've seen messaging from the Adam Laxalt campaign that we thought would become a little more moderate after he secured that primary, but he has stuck to his message, MAGA politics. He's pro-rights. You know, he does support an abortion ban, a national abortion ban, that in a state that supports abortion, like Nevada. Adam Laxalt is doubling down for those Republican voters. Meanwhile, you have Catherine Cortez Masto with voters who have said they're upset at the economy and they're upset at the rising and the rise in the price of housing, gas, and just groceries in general. So Nevada's going to be a very interesting place. Chuck, when you look at the numbers, the one thing that is clear is registered voters in Nevada. You know, a year ago when we went into Nevada to take a look at how things were, we saw one county that was even between nonpartisans, Republicans, and Democrats. And now we are seeing that at a state level, about 1/3 Republican, 1/3 Democrat, and 1/3 nonpartisan. So the only group of voters that we have seen increase when it comes to registered voters is the nonpartisans.
Right.
So that's what's making this a toss-up, and this is why Republicans think they can flip those voters, or at least make them from being nonpartisan to Republicans. But it's going to be difficult for Republicans, again, because of the messaging coming from Adam Laxalt.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I saw a Laxalt attack ad on Cortez Masto earlier today, Guad, that was focused on rape kits and saying that as Attorney General, Catherine Cortez Masto didn't finish the job. When he became Attorney General, he did. What it told me is he was looking for another way to try to send a message to women voters that he's not against them.
Right. So, the messaging from both campaigns is so different, Chuck. On the very same day, you can see a message from the Catherine Cortez Masto campaign blaming Adam Laxalt for an attempt to take away the right to abortion for people in Nevada. And that very same day, Adam Laxalt will put out a message saying all of the problems in Nevada, especially when it comes to the economy, are because of Catherine Cortez Masto being in the Senate or President Biden. So the messaging has been very different from both campaigns on a daily basis. We have seen a lot of attack ads coming from the right side.
Right.
But definitely the one thing I can say is that Democrats have invested a lot more in these the campaigns, especially when it comes to Latinos. It's projected that 1 out of 5 voters in these midterms in Nevada will be Latino.
Well, look, it does seem to me that the Republicans have also, I saw that Club for Growth's running a very Trump-aligned ad with Laxalt. Tells me they do not see persuadable voters in Nevada. They see this as base turnout. So we shall see. Quad Venegas in Nevada for us. Quad, thank you. Let me move over to North Carolina. And there's going to be a big Trump rally tonight. My obsession with North Carolina Senate is this, Vaughn. Because the 2 nominees are actually not household names, and I say that with no disrespect to either Ted Budd or Sherry Beasley, that it really is sort of a generic test of the 2 parties and which message resonates better.
And it's largely also why it's very much sort of the under-the-radar Senate race. There's a very reasonable possibility here that either of these candidates could pull off a win. And Ted Budd, who is the incumbent Republican congressman who is now running for Senate on the Republican side, he is somebody who won with Trump's endorsement this primary, but now facing Sherry Beasley, who is the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And so while Ted Budd has tried to make this, to a certain extent about crime and law enforcement, Sherry Beasley has batted that away, suggesting that she has been working within the justice system for more than a decade now. And you have seen her, on the flip side, try to focus on abortion as an issue, particularly going into a lot of these exurbs around the likes of Raleigh and Durham, Charlotte, to go and connect with these women voters that could potentially, maybe Republicans, but when it comes to pro-abortion rights, are potentially flippable on a major issue.
Vaughn, let's talk about the former president. This QAnon flirtation is becoming, it seems, no longer a flirtation, but I guess it's strategy now?
Right, and look, he is choosing to continue to hold rallies here. Earlier this month, he had the one in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, here in North Carolina. Next week, it's in Michigan. And at each of these events, he is bringing the likes of the statewide candidates who he backed and got to the point of being in the general election to come and join the stage with him. Mehmet Oz, J.D. Vance. Here's going to be Ted Budd, who, to note, over the last couple of weeks has tried to somewhat not make Donald Trump the forefront of his campaign. And next week, he's going to be with Tudor Dixon, the gubernatorial candidate in Michigan here. This is the same day that he announced a super PAC. Essentially, he's got $92 million in his leadership PAC, and there's a lot of nuance on how the FEC rules apply to each of these, but he's going to be able to use that money, that $92 million, move it over to the super PAC, and if he so chooses, to spend endlessly on any of these down ballot races. At the same time, along with the announcement of the super PAC here today, there was no commitment to spend any of that money on those down ballot races at a time in which Republicans at the Senate and at the gubernatorial level, they frankly need it.
Well, we shall see what he does tonight, and if he does anything that makes some of these Republican candidates that are standing with him a bit uncomfortable. That's the wild card with Trump rallies. Vaughn Hilliard in North Carolina for us. Vaughn, thank you. Now let's go to Pittsburgh. That's where we find Elon Moy, my colleague from CNBC. You were covering Kevin McCarthy's rollout today. Don't call it a contract with America, commitment for America, and I know this was slightly delayed. But that is a really, the biggest sort of head scratcher I have on this feels about a month too late. But tell us about it.
Yeah, so essentially Republicans say that they have been working on this commitment to America for about a year and a half. These are the principles that they believe that they can win on, where they have the upper hand. They made a lot out of the fact that they rolled out this agenda at a factory in Washington County and not on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. There are about 36 Republican members there, members of leadership, members, rank and file members, as well as representatives from the Freedom Caucus. So they really tried to present this as a unified agenda. And one thing that they said was important about this is that they listened to voters. This was framed as sort of a town hall style event. We heard a lot about the economy from Republicans today. Now, I spoke with GOP leader Kevin McCarthy, and I tried to press him on what exactly they would do about the economy, about inflation. He said that they would try to make the individual tax cuts that they passed back in 2017 permanent. They would try to reinstate some work requirements on government programs. But bottom line, he said that right now inflation is high, the stock market is down, and he said that Biden's policies have already thrown the country into a recession.
The market's going to go up and down, but it's a reflection of these Biden policies that have brought us to this situation. It's inflation and whether the future is going to be better than today. That's why in 46 days, if you look at the commitment to America, we're the only ones with a plan to solve the problems that the Democrats created. I think the market will go up after that.
So a pretty bold prediction there that a Republican win in November will send the market soaring. Chuck, it's, a very volatile indicator, so we'll see what happens with that. But, markets go up and they go down as well.
Yeah, no, politicians got to learn that. I don't get it. Be careful attaching yourself to something you have no control over. Ilan Moy, congressional correspondent for our sister network, CNBC. Ilan, thank you very much for your report. Coming up, we have more money and more problems. Meet America's rising class of political oligarchs with a look at the reporting behind this week's episode of Meet the Press Reports. We'll have that next. Plus, Russian-occupied areas are voting in a sham referendum inside of Ukraine as a new UN report finds that Russian soldiers have carried out unspeakable atrocities against children. We'll have the latest on the war and where it's headed. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. If you look at the number of donors in this election cycle, you might think that Democrats are winning the fundraising battle. But they're losing where it counts. Big dollar donations. An analysis of recent FEC data shows that 57% of donations over $10 million went to Republicans, 43% went to Democrats. Two of the biggest Democratic mega donors from the last couple of cycles, Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, they're not funding campaigns at the same rate they did in the last midterm cycle. Of course, they were readying their own presidential campaigns. They're now giving under 5% of what their donations were in 2018. That's a huge loss for Democrats. Hey, it's their money. They can do what they want with it. Their saving grace has been billionaire George Soros, who has stepped up his campaign contributions to fill in some of those gaps. But regardless of party, the role of these big dollar donations has grown so significantly over the last few election cycles that it's more than just putting more money into the system. It's actually changing in ways how the system works. On this week's episode of Meet the Press Reports, we dove deeper into the people behind the campaign funding. Who are these people and what do they want? And yes, we're calling them America's oligarchs because they're that wealthy, they're that rich, and they're looking for that much influence. Here's a look into one of those big conservative donors.
Good evening. Among the most active political players is Peter Thiel. The Silicon Valley tech billionaire and PayPal founder has thrown tens of millions of dollars behind just two Senate candidates. In Ohio, he's backing fellow venture capitalist and political outsider J.D. Vance. In Arizona, Thiel donated heavily to the campaign of Blake Masters. Each clinched their respective GOP nominations. And while Masters is happy to espouse his far-right political positions,
in Arizona, there's an invasion at our southern border.
He's much less forthcoming with details about the financial relationship with Thiel, who's estimated to be worth $3.8 billion.
We're just trying to talk about campaign finance.
Producer Ezra Kaplan tried to press the issue with Masters outside an event closed to the press in Scottsdale last month.
Peter gave what he gave, and I'm grateful that he supported that outside group, and I'm working hard every day to raise the money internal to the campaign that we need to go out and spread the message.
Will you be able to stay independent with the money?
Jake Ward is the correspondent behind the reporting of our latest episode of Meet the Press Reports, and he joins me now. So we focused on a couple of billionaire donors. We had Peter Thiel, who's involved in two of the biggest Senate races in the country, Ohio and Arizona. We were focusing Arizona there. I had a one-on-one with Sam Bankman-Fried, one of the crypto billionaires, who has broken records. What's interesting to me and what Sam said and what I've heard from others is that these billionaires, Jacob, always claim, no. I don't expect anything back. But they get their phone call returned a lot quicker than you and I, don't they?
That's absolutely right. And I mean, Chuck, you don't become a billionaire without being extremely strategic about where you spend your money. And, you look at some of the tactics pioneered by people like the Koch brothers, and you see that, they really transformed over time. In a 2021 interview, Charles Koch, in fact, told an interviewer that he said, we used to give our money to elections directly, but then we decided we instead should go to nonpartisan think tanks, universities, and try and sort of seed the ground to then create a place where the candidates of our dreams could grow, right? And you're seeing with Peter Thiel a new tactic, which is to not put money into the general election, but to pour money instead into primaries. Your money goes further. You wind up
thinking like a venture capitalist, right?
I would say people.
It's like a startup.
That's right, exactly, because you don't become. That's right. You don't become successful unless you are strategic with this kind of stuff. But here's the thing. I just want to say, Chuck, something that really opened my eyes in this report, something I really hadn't understood, is that if you look at the political leanings of billionaires, you would be forgiven for assuming, the way I did going into this, that there's a pretty even split ideologically between left and right when it comes to billionaires. But it turns out when we talk to academics who actually study these billionaires, they find that, in fact, the only people who speak out tend to be left-leaning billionaires. That's people like George Soros, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett. The people on the more conservative side of things are extraordinarily quiet. So quiet that academics actually refer to it as stealth politics. That's a big part of our reporting. It is a very quiet, very powerful funding base going after stuff that in many cases is utterly divorced from what mainstream voters are interested in. So there's a very big current. This river is hidden and moving fast, and it's something we don't get to see very clearly here in America.
Jacob, we were trying so hard. I think, I want to pat you on the back, pat our team on the back. We tried really hard. Covering campaign finance for television is never easy. And we wanted to bring this alive a little bit. The number of billionaires who spend all this money, influence the public square, influence how tax dollars are spent, they won't even return our calls. Richard Uihlein, I know we tried that. We tried all of these, and Richard Uihlein basically is the man, almost a solo individual behind the Club for Growth, and if they're in like multiple states. And we do think you got to know what the agenda is of the billionaires.
It's absolutely right, Chuck. And you're right. We went after many billionaires to try to get their comments, to talk to them about the role of money in politics, to talk to them about their ambitions. Nobody was interested in speaking to us. And that's a common theme. It turns out that, while this is an extraordinarily politically active group, by one estimate, 90% of billionaires are giving money to politics in some form. They were not speaking to us about it. This is, of course, the post-Citizens United world, right? The Supreme Court decision that made the giving of money through corporations a form of free speech, and that basically created the super PAC and the dark money nonprofits that power them. It created a whole ecosystem that we really have a very difficult time looking into. And what's ironic about it is we talked to the architect of Citizens United, a lawyer named James Bopp. He said that he was trying to, in fact, in many ways, counteract the power of those kinds of billionaires. And yet here we are in a world where Blake Masters, one of his primary backers is Peter Thiel, whereas his opponent, Mark Kelly, is funded almost entirely by small donations. And so you really have these people creating candidates in their image. Blake Masters was a student of Peter Thiel's at Stanford University and is now out here on the campaign trail with his money, pushing ideas that he agrees with. And we don't have an opportunity to speak to Thiel. We approached him for comment. He would not comment. And so you have these big actors in politics really shaping the way our government works and our country takes form, and yet we cannot really investigate how they give their money or talk to them directly about their positions because we live in a world of self-politics, Chuck.
No, and what's really frustrating is that it almost feels as if the Byzantine nature of the way campaign donations are allowed to be given, disclosed or not disclosed, that's a feature of the system for these billionaires, not a bug. We got to simplify and amplify.
That's absolutely correct. I think there are so many interesting ideas that people have proposed on the possibility of fighting back against it. One of them is just an academic notion, but imagine a world in which there would in some way be a funded, subsidized lobby pushing back against some of the ideas that billionaires might be interested in. So much of the grassroots stuff that we see in this country doesn't have the proper funding to push back against it. And so it really is a lopsided system, and one that is still taking form here, Chuck.
That's right. Money always finds a way. Jake Ward. Appreciate your work on this, and please catch more of Jake's reporting on this week's episode of Meet the Press Reports. It's available on demand wherever you're watching us right now or wherever you get NBC News. Up next, Trump's legal scorecard, potential midterm disruptions, and another public January 6 hearing. Why it all matters as voters gear up to hit the polls 46 days away. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Donald Trump's lawyers have 1 week to state on the record that the former president has, as he has repeatedly claimed in the public square, declassified the documents seized by the FBI at Mar-a-Lago, or that the FBI misrepresented its findings in court. The Mar-a-Lago investigation is one of at least a half dozen criminal and civil cases facing the former president at this moment. He's got the civil lawsuit brought by New York's Attorney General, who accuses him and his family of financial fraud through the Trump Organization. She also made a criminal referral on that fraud to the Southern District of New York and the IRS. We'll see what they do with it. In Georgia, the Fulton County's DA is investigating efforts to overturn the 2020 election. It's an investigation that is focused on Trump and his inner circle. Remember the infamous phone call with the Secretary of State. The January 6th committee is continuing its investigation in the attack on the Capitol with what's believed to be its final public hearing next Wednesday. Every single one of them has the potential to keep making headlines leading up to the midterms. So for more, I'm joined by Asma Khalid, White House correspondent for NPR, Simone Sanders Townsend, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris and host of Simone on MSNBC, and Jim Dornan, Republican strategist and political and government affairs consultant. Asma, let me start with you in this. Trump is not an October surprise. But what all of these legal dramas are these sort of, you don't know what day they hit, but you know that it's like these little landmines between now and November, because I've noticed a lot more Democratic advertising is mentioning Trump more and more. And so this feels like it could matter in the midterm.
And the Democrats that I talk to, are certainly thrilled about this. We talk about this all the time, that a midterm is supposed to be a referendum, in theory, on the president in power. And really, by Donald Trump's sort of continued presence, it's become a choice. And Democrats that I talk to think that that's a good thing for the president and the president in power, and, Democrats who are down ticket as well.
I would agree. Yeah. I do think it's, look, I think that it is very beneficial to the Democrats who are currently on the ballot, and I'm talking specifically about these governor's races, Senate races, these state legislative races for sure, to be talking about that you have one political party that is dedicated to doing whatever they can to lower inflation, that will uphold democracy and freedoms, and you have another political party that is focused on trying to relitigate an election that is settled. And
it's an us
former
versus
president.
Them. Basically an us versus them argument, right?
You mentioned
not necessarily us versus them, because that we're all Americans, but I do think it's like election deniers versus everybody else. People who believe the sky is blue versus the folks that think it's purple. And where do you want to stand?
Jim?
It is beyond frustrating from where I stand to have to watch this. We had the momentum at our back. Everything was going great. The Mar-a-Lago raid notwithstanding, Trump could have just kept that quiet, but no, he had to make this about him.
He never had to say a thing.
We wouldn't have known.
We didn't have to
we
know.
Had no idea.
He actually never had to say a thing. He chose to tell us.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point.
He chose to tell us.
It's difficult to watch because things were going so well 3 months ago, and all you have to do is look at Trump's numbers. No wonder Democrats are happy. I'd be happy too if I were a Democrat.
Asma, in our last poll, the fewest number of Republicans identified as a Trump supporter over the Republican Party that we've measured since we started taking that measurement in this poll for 6 years.
Right?
Yeah,
it's highly unusual. And I do think, the former president's instincts may not always be right, but I think by interjecting himself in the conversation, he thought that would help, help him, help the party. And I think initially, in those first few days, there did seem to be, I spoke to Republicans, and the news came out, and I was in Florida, and I went to a local Republican Women's Club meeting, and there was a sense that more than anything else, the Mar-a-Lago raid was going to energize the base of the party. I think as it's dragged on.
The 35% that support him,
yes,
Exactly.
What about the rest of the suburban Republicans?
I think there was
that's just
there was a sense, though, that it would energize people who felt like going after the former president in such a public way. I think that was an incorrect assumption.
Right.
But in the initial days, I do think there was Republican energy, say the first couple days, the first week, as it's dragged on, as we've seen even Trump-appointed judges clearly not really go the way he thought they were going to go.
Exactly.
I think that the narrative has changed.
Yes, I agree with that.
Let me talk about sort of what I feel like we're watching in the midterms and sort of go, Simone, which is the fact that everybody's right. meaning there are some places where crime, the economy is trumping some other issues, and you see Republicans benefiting. You see other places where abortion, democracy, and anti-Trump rhetoric is working. You take a place like Arizona, it feels like that's a democracy state, if you will. You take a place like Nevada, let's go Wisconsin, and right now, Ron Johnson's turning it into a referendum on the issue of crime. So it really does feel like there's not a national, but it's like we're in these cross currents here. How would you be navigating this?
Look, I have long since said that I think Democratic candidates this cycle have to ensure that they are running their races and not trying to run to a national conversation. I hear a lot of my Republican friends often say, most recently I was in some conversation with some very prominent Republicans, former electeds, who said, you know, people are going to vote on kitchen table issues across the country. Yes, but depending on where you are, your kitchen table issue is different. For some people, their kitchen table issue is, in fact, abortion, access to the health care that they need. In some places, their kitchen table issue is crime, and so I think it's very important that these folks know their districts. I go back to Pat Ryan.
And in fairness, crime could be, you may be worrying about, you may be worrying not enough cops on the street, or you may be worrying about too many guns on the street, which is a different part of the electorate.
Yes, public safety. It depends. So it really depends on where you are. Look at Pat Ryan. Pat Ryan, New York 19, was a bellwether race. The issue was freedom, and he couched abortion under freedom, and it worked for him.
Same with Kansas. Right now, I see two waves, right? There's Trump plus abortion versus inflation plus crime. So going exactly to your point, Simone, that's going to determine who wins what, because it differs in every place, like your correspondent said earlier.
You know what's interesting, Asma, today is that Kevin McCarthy, I don't think, said the word abortion at all, right? You know, it didn't want to touch it, and you know, we know what he wants the election to be about. But there's certainly Democrats don't want to touch some issues, and some of them, I think, been too reluctant to deal with the crime issue. I think the House tried to deal with this. The joke is it's the Val Deming Senate Campaign Act in the House.
I mean, immigration's been one that's also tricky for Democrats, right? I mean, I was talking to a Democrat the other day who said, I mean, there's a recognition among some Democratic big city mayors that they have seen an uptick in people moving. They recognize also that the way that Republicans have responded, say governors in Florida and Texas, the Democratic narrative is that's inhumane. Yeah. And that is true, but, you know, the criticism of Democrats is, well, then what's the solution?
What is your solution?
I really think, again, it depends on where you are. I think for some folks, Cuellar, Texas, there are some races in Texas along the border that this is a key issue for them. You have to be willing to talk about and attack the issue. The fact that there have been more apprehensions over the last couple of months means that CBP is doing their job, means that the Biden administration policy is working. Democratic candidates, and not even candidates, Democratic mayors should be willing to say that the process is working. And the reason there are apprehensions is because the Biden border policy is well on its way.
Well, and this is where I give Abbott and DeSantis a little bit of credit, because this was, in my opinion, a base Republican issue, immigration. That it didn't really affect the Democrats.
We see it in our polls. The people most fired up about it are basically base Republicans.
Right, exactly right. And now with these moves, which originally I thought were pretty brilliant, now I think it's getting a little hackneyed, are bringing it to the public, to the public. And so Democrats, Republicans are all seeing it now, too.
But Asma, let's, on the immigration issue, nobody has an incentive to actually provide a solution, because the right likes it as an issue, and the left's fearful of the solution because it alienates certain parts.
True, and for the Democrats too. I mean, here's a cynic in me saying also, I mean, I think it's effective to be able to say that what DeSantis and Abbott did was immoral, and to continue to be able to have this as an issue, to say that it's immoral. I mean, the Democrats haven't, you've seen the Democratic Party, I would say, we did a story on this since the 90s, kind of shift to the left on immigration, but that's not necessarily, you know, you're not offering necessarily tangible solutions, is the criticism.
Well, and I'm curious, Simone, on this, because it does feel like that both parties have gotten farther away, right? The Republicans, there were a lot more Republicans open to Dreamers getting citizenship 4 years ago.
I think Dreamers are still pretty popular, though. Like, if you poll folks, the Dreamers are the most popular.
But you had a lot of elected Republicans comfortable being for a pathway to citizenship. You don't hear that anymore. No. And then you also don't hear a lot about border security among Democrats.
That's what I was going to say. You also had Democrats. It was in their platform, if you go back to the 90s.
It was in the...
Not in the
90s. We can look to 2008.
Yeah, that's true.
The Obama-Biden administration policy on immigration, and that first time, honey, it was not what the Biden-Harris administration policy looks like now. Look, I think I worked on border issues when I was at the White House. Obviously, the border issues, root causes of migration, that was in the vice president's portfolio. Worked on those things. There are the problem here is obviously there's no easy solution, and you have to choose your words wisely, because on one hand, the activists will come for you and say you're being inhumane, you're not saying people should be able to seek asylum. On another hand, folks will say you sound like Donald Trump.
All right, I want to close with this. Ted Budd's with Donald Trump today. Good idea or not? You know North Carolina.
No.
You've worked for Richard Burr in the past.
No, I think it's a terrible idea. I think that there are too many, and I sound like a broken record, suburban college-educated suburban women who are looking at Trump and going, my God, when is he going to go away?
And Simone Valdemings is skipping a Biden-Charlie Crist event in Florida. What do you think?
You know, I'm interested. I'm interested. Look, I think Valdemings has calculated that what is best for her is to be somewhere else at that time. And I think Charlie Crist has calculated, rightfully so, that what's best for him is to be standing there with Joe Biden.
Well, when
got to run your race.
When you're missing a couple of dollars in your bank account, as Charlie Crist is, you'll take any help you can get right now on that one. Asma, Simone, and Jim, thank you all. After the break, we have historic unrest and public acts of defiance by women intensify in Iran. This is actually really, in some ways, inspiring. We'll see what happens, though. The latest in the protest and the regime's attempts to quell them. And the U.S. response is ahead. Welcome back. Iran's president is now back in Tehran after attending the UN General Assembly. He returns to mass protests in his country after a 22-year-old woman was arrested for not following the country's strictly enforced dress code. She later died while in police custody. Iran's police claims she had a pre-existing condition and died of a heart attack. Her family denies those claims. In response, the U.S. announced sanctions on Iran's morality police. And the State Department says they are taking steps to expand internet access in Iran, despite the government's internet blackouts. Joined now by our Tehran bureau chief, Ali Arouzi. Ali, what's it look like today? And we are able to talk with you, which means that the shutting down of the internet has been lifted, at least temporarily. What can you tell us?
Hey, Chuck. Well, look, the protests are still going on nationwide in all four corners of Iran. People have been protesting for 7 days. They're still going on tonight. But, you know, the security presence has become massive across the country. The authorities here are determined to put this down, but there's still a big group of determined youth to reach their rights. But, Chuck, we have some equipment that we can get on air with. That's not the same for the rest of the country here. The internet is completely down in Iran. It's barely working. You can't access any search engines. No apps work. No social media works. None of that works. You can't go into Google. And most importantly for the authorities here, people can't message each other, which means they can't mobilize in different locations. And equally important to the authorities, they can't upload videos of the rolling crackdown. There is no documentation anymore of what's going on in the streets, and that's an ominous sign of what may come if these protests don't settle down. But there is an atmosphere of great tension here right now, and it's very somber. I mean, you'll hear in the distance cars honking, people shouting. You'll see tired people coming back from the protests. Riot police spread across the city, and you just don't know what every new day is going to bring here, because this is such a big subject here. The headscarf was the biggest taboo for the Islamic Republic to take it off. I mean, this was one of the pillars of the revolution. And just to put it in some perspective for you, Chuck, there were a group of women a couple of years ago called the Girls of Revolutionary Street. Lone women would stand on a utility box, take off their headscarf and start waving it on the street. They would be promptly arrested, and they would get double-digit jail sentences. Now you're seeing girls across Iran burning their headscarves, cutting their hair. And the authorities here are going to do everything to try and put this back in the box, but the genie is now out of the bottle. It's a whole new day here, and it's a serious problem now for the Islamic Republic about what are they going to do now about the hijab, about other social injustices that go on here. And it's also incredible, Chuck. You're seeing 17, 18-year-old girls that have dyed their hair blue or yellow or green. facing off with riot police, saying, I'm not going to put my headscarf back on. We saw a video today of a young girl in Tehran standing on a bench in the middle of the street. The female morality police had come to arrest her. She goes, I'm just not going with you. I'm not putting my headscarf on. I'm not going with you. And there were people on the streets supporting her. But the government are also calling on their supporters to come out. There have been large government rallies today. They're planned tomorrow. So the tension keeps increasing, and we just don't know where this whole thing's going to go.
Ali, you've been reporting for us for decades. Compare this to 2009.
It has some similarities because it's a very youthful movement. They're talking about social injustices. They want change, but that was a very different beast then. That, I think, that at the beginning, that was about people not wanting Ahmadinejad to come back into power. And the thing really got out of hand. This is a leaderless movement of people that want their rights. So it's a bit different this time.
Ali Arouzi in Tehran for us. Ali, I know this is not an easy assignment, especially at times like this. Stay safe. Thanks for your reporting. Still to come, we're on the ground in Ukraine where the Kremlin is orchestrating a possible pretext for further annexation. This against a backdrop of alleged war crimes. A gruesome new United Nations report. Growing backlash in Russia. You're watching Meet the Press now.
So we understand that this so-named referendums, it will be absolutely, I don't know how to name it. It will means nothing.
Meaningless. You believe it's meaningless?
Absolutely, absolutely. It means nothing, not for Ukraine, not for civilized world.
Welcome back. That was part of my exclusive interview with the Prime Minister of Ukraine yesterday, calling the referendums that began today, quote, meaningless. 4 Russian-occupied regions began voting, and we put that in air quotes, in what many countries, including the United States, are calling a sham. The U.S. and Western allies are warning that Russia will manipulate the results and use it as a pretext to annex more Ukrainian territory. And, of course, then after that, then it becomes you're attacking Russia. And that's a new pretext that, obviously, Mr. Putin would like to create. Meanwhile, in Izum, Ukrainian officials say they have finished exhuming bodies from that mass grave that was discovered. It's a total of 436 bodies that were found. Most of them appeared to have died violently. 30 of them showed signs of torture. All of this comes as the United Nations Human Rights Council made it public a report today with some extremely disturbing findings. The report details a lengthy list of atrocities, including finding that Russian troops raped and tortured children, carried out a, quote, large number of executions. So I'm joined now by Richard Engel. He's in Kharkiv, Ukraine. And Richard, the conversations I had with the Ukrainian Prime Minister and the German Chancellor, they both said these crimes are going to be documented, and someday, some point, Putin will be held accountable. But that's a long way off.
It might be a long way off, but war crimes tribunals often will take decades before they achieve some sort of result. And what we're seeing here, unlike in other conflicts I've seen before, is they are in a systematic way trying to document each and every case. They are not just looking for the most egregious examples. They're not just looking for that one mass grave. They are, and I watched this happen in Izum, they are literally digging up old graves, pulling the bodies, some of them in a terrible state of decomposition, and they are trying to retroactively figure out how these people died, who may have killed them, collect witness accounts. The government is doing this. I've seen independent journalists who are doing this as well. They've created flip books where they have the faces of potential suspects, alleged war criminals, Russian soldiers, and investigators are going house to house, asking survivors, asking witnesses, have they seen this person? Do they recognize that face? They're also combing through Russian social media once they have a match to see if they can find that person's profile. They're looking at tattoos. They're using some rudimentary AI to try and make connections through social media. So this is a civil, public, and private effort that has been going on for 7 months now. And when you try and compile this kind of data, and once you have a sort of a quorum of information, you actually get better at it. So once they start to recognize names and recognize faces, then they get more clues, and the clues build on each other.
I don't have a lot of time, but I'm curious, what is the Ukrainian government, are they attempting anything to sort of push back at these referendums in these occupied areas of Ukraine?
Only so far as to discredit them, and generally they seem to be discrediting themselves. You have a referendum being held in 4 different areas under duress, under Russian occupation. You have Russian-backed militias going house to house, in some cases armed, according to witness accounts, asking people publicly to vote yes or no. Do they want to join up with Russia, in front of people who clearly want the answer to be yes, join up with Russia. So I think these are not going to be considered credibly internationally, let alone by Ukrainian officials.
Richard Engel in Kharkiv for us tonight. Richard, thank you. And as always, sir, please stay safe. We'll be back next week with more Meet the Press Now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.